All right, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko rangi nui ki runga, ko papatua nuku kei raro. Ko ngā tangata kei wainga nui, te hei mauri ora. E te whānau o Cognition Education, e ngā iwi o te motu, e ngā mauhiri tuarangi. Haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. Ka nui te koa me te hari ki te kite e a koutou. Tēnā koutou ki a koutou, kua tai mai nei ki te tautoko te kaupapa o tēnei rā. E hara ahau I te tangata mōhio ki te kōrero, o tira e tika ana kia mihi atu kia mihi mai. E tika ana te kōrero I o tātou tupuna. Nau te rauro, naku te rauro, ka ki te kete. Haumie, huie, tai kie. Ko Waitakere te maunga, ko Waitemata te moana, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, no o pōta ki tōku pāpā, no whanga rei tōku whaia, no tamaki makauro ahau, kei kiri kiri tōku kāinga noho I nāianei, ko Jenna Crowley tōku ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. On behalf of Cognition Education, I'd like to welcome you all here today via this online platform that allows us to connect with each other to create relationships, learn from each other, and share knowledge. My name is Jenna Crowley. I'm the Regional Manager for Te Tai Tokoro at Cognition. I'm pleased to be able to open our session this morning, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us today during your school holidays break. Cognition Education are pleased to be able to host this webinar, and I'm sure you will be as excited as we are to hear from our guests today. Assessment, both formative and summative, are and always have been hot topics in education globally. There are a plethora of apps, platforms, and research-informed literature available internationally, centered on effective assessment and its impact, much of which I'm sure our audience today are familiar with. However, as always in education, we know there's always more to learn and that the most effective educators are those who never cease their own learning journey. Today, we're joined by the wonderful Thomas Guskey, who is here to share his thoughts, extensive knowledge and experience with us. Tom joins us from his home in Kentucky, where it's actually yesterday. Tom's a Professor Emeritus in the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. He's the author or editor of 25 award-winning books and more than 250 book chapters, articles, and professional papers on educational measurement, evaluation, assessment, grading, and professional learning. Took that from his website. It was his book entitled Evaluating Professional Development that was my own first engagement with his work as part of my study for my master's. Tom has a long list of academic accolades, papers, and books dedicated to helping teachers and school leaders use quality academic research to help their students learn well and be successful. Tom writes these pieces in order to give back to the profession he's so invested in. He's also very keen on promoting collaborative partnerships between teachers, parents, and students in an effort to understand how assessment information can be unpacked and understood for the benefit of all who support the student. Finally, Tom is also on our education advisory panel here at Cognition. We're lucky to have his expertise available to inform and influence our mahi in the New Zealand education space. And I might also add that he hopes to one day find a cure for cancer, so people can include that when introducing him for his talks. I'm sure you'll all enjoy me in warmly welcoming this morning, Tom Guskey.
Thank you, Jenna. And thanks to everybody for being a part of our session today. I'm so honored to be here to share with you ideas about assessment in particular today and to be invited to be a part of this webinar. I wanted to begin by sharing with you just a little bit about where it is that I'm coming from today. As Jenna said, I live in Lexington, Kentucky. Those of you familiar with the geography of the US, this is where the state of Kentucky is located. We sort of suffer identity confusion here because we're too far south to be a part of the North. We're too far north to be part of the South. We're too far west to be really part of the East. We're kind of in the middle of everywhere. Where I live is a town called Lexington. which is where the university is located. Lexington is a city of about 380,000 people. It's not nearly as large as Auckland. We would be much closer in size to Christchurch there in New Zealand. And Lexington, Kentucky is known for two things. First of all, we are the center of the thoroughbred horse industry. The city is surrounded by these horse farms where thoroughbreds are bred. There's a photograph of, you can see some of the farms with the city in the background. And we are just getting ready for one of the biggest races of the year called the Kentucky Derby, which is always held on the first Saturday of May. And I am on the faculty at the University of Kentucky, which is located right here in the city. The other thing, of course, for which Lexington is noted, and Kentucky in particular, is we are the center of the bourbon whiskey industry. And so if you are fond of bourbon, you have probably sampled some of our products. I also wanted to begin by sharing with you some contact information for me, so that if today's session prompts questions or concerns, if there are issues that come up on which I can be helpful, I hope you won't hesitate to get in touch with me. And there are several ways that you can. I do have a website, and that is just tgusky.com. If you go there, you can find articles on assessment. There's articles on grading practices, a whole section of things on professional learning, and then also on instruction and mastery learning, they're there. I write a regular blog for a publication here in the States called Education Week that takes on some of the most current hot topics in education. You can find those there as well. If you want to contact me through email, my email address here at the university is just gusky@uky.edu. Those of you who follow Twitter are welcome to contact me through Twitter as well. That's just @tgusky. And there you can see my phone number. However, if you call that number, the phone that is beside me here on the desk is going to ring. So it's not as though you need to go through lots of people to contact me at all. In the short time we have available today, there are three areas that I'd really like to share with you with regard to assessments, to recognize really the need for classroom assessments to serve as learning tools rather than just evaluation devices. We're going to talk about the effective use of traditional and what were sometimes called alternative assessment formats. One of the ideas that I will be stressing to you today is there is no perfect assessment format. That with assessments, what is most crucial is you always adapt the format to fit the learning goals. And so it's the learning goals that will guide you in what is the best format to gather information on those. And then finally, we're going to talk about some guidelines for implementing really high quality classroom assessments. So I hope that falls in line with your expectations for our session. So with that in mind, let's get started. Oh, and I wanted to remind you too, if as we're going along, there's anything I'm describing that is unclear, if it prompts questions, please take the opportunity to just jot those into the chat. We're going to monitor that as we go along. And I've shared with Jenna and others that I really don't mind if as questions come up, if they just let me know, we'll stop and we'll go into those issues with as much detail as I can provide, and hopefully be helpful to you along the way. Now, I should also share with you a bit of my background in this area because it's not at all traditional. I was not originally trained as an educator. Actually, my undergraduate major in college is physics and electrical engineering. But I graduated from college with my degree in that area to discover that I have no talent in that field at all, which was a terrible disappointment to my father, who's an engineer. And I was at a party one night, which I did a lot at that time, talking to a friend of mine who was looking for a teaching job. And he told me about this private school that needed a middle grade math teacher who could also coach. And I thought that would be interesting. So I went and applied for the job and they hired me. My father, to this day, claims the only reason I was hired is I passed the mirror test. They put a mirror under my nose, it fogged in, so I got the job because they were desperate to find a middle grade math teacher to begin the school year. But I began teaching the middle grades, and here that was grade 7 and 8, and I just fell in love with it. I know a lot of people struggle with that age of young people, but I just thought they were terrific. So I began then taking education classes to gain my certification, which I did. Then after a few years, I went on and decided I wanted to go back to graduate school to learn how to become a better teacher. I began in Boston and then ended up at the University of Chicago, where my chair, my advisor, the chair of my doctoral dissertation committee was Benjamin Bloom. It is Benjamin Bloom who actually brought the name formative assessment to the field of education. And so it is from that background and that training that many of my ideas and that have grown. So keep that in mind as we go forward today. I'd like to start by sharing with you 4 sort of crucial steps in assessment, effective assessment practice. The first step is this, that classroom assessments need to be based on an assessment priority. And that priority really needs to be communicated to everyone who is involved. That teachers need to communicate that to the students, to other teachers, to parents, everything. Now, when we talk about assessment priorities and views of the purpose of assessments, the traditional view is that assessments serve these 2 different purposes. The first is the purpose of feedback and learning, and the second is the purpose of accountability and grading. Now, the challenge for us as educators is that the purpose you choose actually can take you in a very different direction. If your purpose is really feedback and learning, then you really need to be focusing on that feedback aspect of it, rather than the idea of generating scores or generating grades in any way. And that brings us to this distinction between sort of formative and summative. The first person to bring these ideas to education was Benjamin Bloom in 1968. In 1968, Benjamin Bloom wrote the first article that really talked about the use of formative assessments as learning tools, actually designed to inform the instructional process. In 1971, he published the very first book entitled The Handbook on Formative and Summative Evaluation of Student Learning. But the point that Bloom stressed, even at that time, was this, that formative or summative is not determined by the content or format of the assessment. You cannot look at an assessment and determine if it is formative or if it is summative. What distinguishes it is the purpose. It's how you use the results. And actually, the same assessment could be both formative and summative. For example, if I'm working with early elementary children, an assessment may be formative until the students get it. And then when you get it, I can say, oh, now these results are summative. They've shown me that they have learned, well, those things. And so when we start this process, what is crucial is we make clear from the very beginning what our purpose is really going to be. Now that leads to the second point. And the second point that Bloom stressed is that if it's going to serve that sort of instructional purpose, that assessments need to become integral parts of the instructional process, that they need to really serve as learning tools rather than just evaluation devices that occur at the end. And much of the valuable work that's been done in this area in New Zealand has been based on this premise, and it's been really terrific work that's been done thus far. But there are 3 implications that come from this distinction that I'd like to describe for you, because often they're missed when people talk about this formative and summative difference, but what this really means. The 3 implications that derive from this distinction actually having them be an integral part of instructional processes. Number 1, assessments need to be a source of information for students as well as for teachers. Now, I know we've all heard that before, but let me ask you this, and tell me if this ever happened to you. You're in a class as a student, you have a big test or assessment coming up, you study very hard, put a lot of time and effort into your preparation. You go in to take the test or assessment, and as the professor or the teacher hands it out, you read it over and say to yourself, oh my goodness, this isn't what I studied. Now, how many of you have had that experience? Just about everybody, right? Let me ask you this. Was that a successful learning experience for you? I doubt it. And think about what that taught you. Because do you know what it taught me? It happened to me too. And it taught me 2 things. The first thing it taught me is that hard work and effort don't pay off in school. Because I'd worked very hard for that test, it meant nothing. And the second thing it taught me, you can't trust teachers. Now, think of that. Are those the implications we want That our students should be learning from us? I don't think so. But we have suffered for so long under this mistaken idea that our tests and assessments need to be secret, that it's somehow unfair to let students know what's going to be on the assessment. Well, who came up with that? Does anybody even know where that came from? You see, I work in an environment, people pay me to figure this out. I can't find it anywhere. And so long as the assessment is secret, then learning for most students becomes a guessing game. And see, that's our challenge. Because most of us were very successful in our educational careers for that very reason. We became very good at guessing what our teachers and professors were going to ask on quizzes and tests. I was an expert at it. When I went into a class, I never studied what I thought was important. I never studied what I thought was stressed in book and materials. I studied what I thought that teacher was likely to ask on a quiz or assessment. And I succeeded in my educational degree. I was able to outguess my teachers. And I know we would say we do this. I mean, I would have said I did this when I first began as a teacher. If anybody asked me what my goals were, what I wanted my students to learn, I would have described things like, well, I want my students to use these ideas. I want them to think. I want them to solve problems and make applications. Wonderful, valuable learning goals. Do you want to know how I tested them? This is what I would do. The night before I was going to give that assessment, I would sit down with my textbook. And I would begin on the first page of the chapter, to come down that first page, find something we could write a question about. I'd write the question. I'd flip over to the next page, find something else I could write a question about, write another question. If I got to the end of the chapter and only had 18 questions, what teacher wants to give a test with 18 questions? You can't use 18. 18 doesn't average very well. You can't get good percentages out of 18. So I go back to the chapter to find 2 more things I could write questions about. So I had a nice 20-point test. Now I know I'm the only one that's ever done that, right? To the degree that assessment matched what I said I wanted my students to learn was by chance. In fact, I know in most instances it did not match at all, because I said I wanted my students to use and apply what they were learning. Do you know what kind of questions I asked? Yes. Recall questions, knowledge level questions, fact questions, a few definitions thrown in here or there. Those are the kind of questions I knew how to ask. And then the degree to which my instruction matched one or the other, oh, that was by chance too. I know there were things I included on my assessments that I didn't spend a lot of time teaching. I would always include a few questions that I referred to with affection as my zingers. My zingers were questions that I would take, from the captions of the photographs. Maybe they had a little footnote at the bottom of one of the pages, one of those little shaded boxes they put in the books, all right, just to see if they're reading the material well. It was a game to me. I would wait to be challenged on this, and it would always happen. We'd be going over the assessments. One of my really bright students would raise their hand and say, "Oh, Mr. Gusky, I don't think that was in the chapter." And I would say, "Oh, no, let's turn to page 58, shall we?" Not an effective strategy. Now, why did I do that? Because it had been done to me. A lot of what was done to us wasn't all that good. And we need to be able to look at these practices and look at them with very different eyes and see what really helped and what didn't. We are communicating to students with assessments. If a student is surprised by anything on a classroom assessment, something went wrong in the teaching. No student should be surprised by anything on a classroom assessment. And not only a source of information for the students, a source of information for us as teachers. And I'm not talking about any sophisticated statistical analysis that you need to conduct. I'm suggesting just make a tally of how many students missed each question or prompt in the assessment. I do this in my classes. We have a little 10-point quiz. All right, as soon as we're finished, I make a little tally. How many students missed each of the questions? If I come to a question on one of my classroom assessments that half the students in the class missed, that is not a student learning problem. That is a teacher problem. And what that says to me is no matter how I taught it, it just did not come across. And I have discovered I am not very good at predicting this. I used to think I was, but I've discovered I'm not at all. There are times I teach lessons and I think they are magnificent. I finish that lesson and say, oh, I was on today. This was great. We should have had video cameras rolling. This was wonderful. But I asked my students about it later and they didn't get it. And see, the bottom line is if they didn't get it, it didn't work. Because whether or not it works is not defined by what we do as teachers. Whether it works is defined by what our students are able to do. And that means we have to have the courage to set aside those pretty powerful ego issues. And I am the worst on this. Truly, I am. When they blow it, my first response is, what's the matter with them? Step back from that and say, no, what can I do differently? How can I approach this differently? See, I've always had this idea that you should be able to stand outside of school at the end of a day. When the students are leaving to go home, to meet their parents, to get on a bus, to walk home, drive, whatever, I think you should be able to stop any student at all who walks out of the building and say, tell me, what did you learn today? And if any student says to you, nothing, you send them right back in the building. Right? No, I mean, think about this. We had this child for what, 5, 6 more hours? Is it too much to expect that every child should have at least one successful learning experience in 6 hours? I think that's pretty modest, but try it and see what you get. Now, you won't always get what you hope. I was doing this at an elementary school pre-COVID. I was at an elementary school talking with young children as they were leaving, and I stopped this one little up. I said, what did you learn today? He said, I learned something really neat today. I said, wow, that's great. Tell me what you learned. He said, well, I learned that if you laugh while you're drinking your milk, it really does come out your nose, right? Granted, that's something, but similarly, I think that headmasters and principals should be able to stand outside of school on a Friday afternoon as we're leaving to go home and stop every one of us a teacher and say, tell me, what did you learn this week as a teacher? And if anybody says nothing, you send them back in the building too, right? There are so many opportunities for us to learn, and this is the big one. This is our feedback. This is lets us know what we did well and where we need to make some improvements. And if you can accept that first implication, it leads to the second. Because if you find out on that assessment that certain things haven't been learned well, you can't be foolish and go on. The second implication is that assessments need to be followed by high quality corrective instruction. Now, this is not reteaching. Do not fall into that trap. I do too often. And the trap is, if some of my students haven't understood what I've already explained, my tendency is to re-explain that idea a second time, pretty much the same way I did the first time, only this time I say it louder and a bit more slowly. I figure they're slow learners. If I talk slower, they'll get it. You want a different modality? Fine. Watch my lips this time. It doesn't work. High quality corrective instruction means qualitatively different from what we did originally. What we're saying is these students can learn, it's just maybe they learn differently. As teachers, we teach as we learn best. It's only natural, and we need to continue that. But we must understand that not all of our students learn best in those same ways. And that means every teacher has to be flexible to provide for those differences. And so these correctives involve a different presentation and different kind of engagement. So here's where all the things you have discussed with regard to differentiating instruction, with regard to different learning preferences or modalities, all of this comes into play. You need to present the material differently from the way it was originally presented and engage students in learning differently from the way they originally engaged. Now, this is not easy. I mean, I'll be the first to admit it's very, very challenging. But you know, of all the resources we've considered, what seems to work best for designing these instructional alternatives? Opportunities to plan collaboratively with colleagues. You see, if you and I have a chance to plan together, it's likely your best approach to something is different from my best approach. And you can be a great resource to me on different strategies I could use, different examples I might employ, different approaches I could take learning. And what we've discovered is that structured opportunities are provided for teachers to plan collaboratively. And not even do they have to teach at the same grade level or have the same academic background. But those structured opportunities to plan collaboratively, not only does it reduce the work of any individual, the quality of the work developed is always far greater. The point is, you just can't go over the assessment. You just cannot tell students what's right or wrong. You must offer them guidance and direction on how to improve. It's much like you probably recall the old story of the mother who had two young sons, and in school they had fallen in with the wrong group and picked up the use of profanity. She tried everything she knew to discourage this terrible, disgusting habit. Nothing seemed to work. And so at wit's end, she decided she was going to have to resort to corporal punishment. They came down for breakfast the next morning. She turned to the first and said, "Bobby, what would you like for breakfast?" Bobby said, "I tell you what, Mom, I think I like some of them damn cornflakes." Well, she walked over, picked up Bobby, spanked him on his bottom, sent him back to his room in tears. His brother had been standing and watching the whole time. She turned to the brother and said, "Now, Tommy, what would you like for breakfast?" And Tommy said, "I don't know, Mom, but you can bet I don't want any of them damn cornflakes." See, he got the feedback. That wasn't the problem. The problem was he didn't know how to use it. And that's the key here. With this feedback, we must provide guidance and direction to students as to how they can improve. And it must be different from the original instruction. And if you can accept that, it leads to the third implication. The third's the most challenging because it's the most different. But it does follow that if assessments are learning tools, if we follow assessments with high quality corrective instruction, the third implication is students must be given a second chance to show improvement. A second chance. Now you see, the writing people throughout the world have pretty much caught on to this. The writing people understand that nobody writes perfectly the first time. And so the opportunity to gain feedback on your writing, to use that feedback to revise what you've written, to do it a second time better than you did the first is built into the writing process. But when I suggest, we might want to do the same thing in math, teachers say, "Oh, but just a minute. I have one group of students, they showed appropriate responsibility. They demonstrated adequate effort that they got it the first time. And now you're telling me for those other laggards, I'm to give them a second chance? How can you defend that?" And then what are you saying? If they get it the second time, I should give them the same honors and privileges, same high mark as those who got it the first time? That would not be fair at all. And besides, this isn't what life is like. You don't always get a second chance in life. Consider I would not want a surgeon operating on me who needs a second chance. I want them to get it right the first time. I would not want a pilot of the jet I'm sitting in needing a second chance landing that jet safely. I want them to get it right the first time. And should we not be preparing our students for what they face in life? Sound familiar? Well, here's my response. Those are really good points. But we need to consider is this. Let's take the case of the surgeon. Do you think you are the first person that surgeon operates on? No. Who is the first person that surgeon operated on? A dead person. A cadaver. A lot of latitude for mistakes there, don't you think? If they really screwed it up and had a terrible day, what's the worst they could do? What, get a pulse? I don't think so, right? Do you think the pilot is landing a jet for the first time? Not a chance. We made her spend hours in a simulator before we ever allowed her to climb into the cockpit of a real jet. This is the way we train professionals in every field. There's no exception. The only exception is what we do with students in our classrooms today. That is the one rare situation you face in your life that is one shot, do or die. Think about it. We want our students to be lifelong learners. We want them to develop learning to learn skills. What better learning to learn skill is there than you learn from your mistakes? That when you make a mistake, learning is no, maybe it's just beginning. Do you know there are assessment experts who argue today that students learn nothing from a successful performance? They only learn when their performance is less than successful, because then they can gain guidance and direction on how to improve. Right? And do I get concerned about the grade? Not really. or the mark? Not really. The way I think of it is this. Let me ask you this. How many of you have a driver's license? How many of you did not pass your driver's license test the first time? Yeah. Now, do you suppose we should go to those who didn't get it right the first time and say, you know, it's not fair to give you the same honors and privileges as we extended those who were adequately prepared for it the first time? So this is what we're going to do. We're not going to let you drive in the rain. I'm sorry. If it starts raining, pull your car over and park, sit there. Don't let us catch you turning on those wipers. And we're going to stamp your license, no rain driving. I mean, no, that would be crazy, right? The same is true here. The bottom line, you learned it and you learned it well. Should that not be the basis of any grade? Of course, right? And that's what we do when we give students marks. We represent what they've learned, not when they learned it. Now, this is different from what many of us have faced as students. It's also different from a lot of traditional approaches, and there are some ways to get it wrong. In particular, here are some practices we know don't work with regard to giving students a second chance or second opportunity. Number one, expecting students to do the corrective work on their own. When teachers first begin, this corrective work must be done in class under the teacher's direction. We find that if the teachers make it voluntary, then the students who do it are those who would already do it for themselves, and the ones who need it the most are the least likely to take part. That's why when teachers ask me, what do I do with those students who don't do the corrective work? My response is, you are assuming I gave them a choice. They have no choice. This is done in class under my direction, and I am right on top of them because I want them to see there's a payoff. I want them to see they get something out of it, because when they do, they're more likely to do it on their own. And that means that I have to take some class time to accomplish that. I have to take some class time in order to do it so that I can take them through this process and gain the success that it brings. That's why you cannot have the correctives complete initially as homework in a special study session. They need to be done in class. The teacher needs to guide kids through this practice. See, this is something that the best students have always done for themselves. I mean, think of it like that. What do the very best students do when a teacher hands back a quiz or an assessment? They always save it. They look at what they got wrong. They ask the teacher about those things. They rework the problems. They look up the answers so they don't make those same mistakes again. How different that is from the poorer students. What do they do with that assessment? It's in the trash can as they're going out the door, if they wait until then. And what we're suggesting is teachers need to compel all of their students to do exactly what the very best have done for themselves, but they have to guide them through the process initially, right? You also want to do this before you proceed to more advanced units. Because if you don't, then you're putting these students in double jeopardy. Now they have to remedy problems from the past by trying to keep up with new material. They're the least likely to be able to do it, right? You can do it without providing some incentive for success in the first assessment, right? This is why when Benjamin Bloom talked about these formative assessments, he said there needs to be some incentive there. He talked about what he called enrichment activities, exciting, challenging learning opportunities that gave students a chance to extend their learning. And we need to make sure they're rewarding that students should want to get into that group. Some teachers try to encourage students to do well in the first one by limiting the score as students get in the second one. That doesn't work because then the mark isn't an accurate reflection of what they've learned, right? Some teachers want to make it harder for students to do after they don't do well in that first one. And some teachers do this by making the second assessment harder. Why would you want to do that? That's like saying, well, I want you to jump over this 1 meter hurdle. And if you can't do it, then I'm going to pull you aside, give you some additional instruction on it. But the next time, the hurdle is going to be 1.5 meters you have to jump over. Well, what sense does that make, right? You've got to keep it parallel. These assessments should cover the same content, same material, and at least do it in a way that is similar to what we did in the first one. Now, that leads me then to the third point I want to stress with you, and that is that different assessment formats really require different types of feedback. When we think of assessment formats, we generally think of 2 different types. There are what we call traditional assessments. And traditional assessments usually composed of these 5 types of items. We have true, false, matching, multiple choice, completion, or essay short answer. Essay short answer is what we call constructed, response item, but it's traditional. We've all had experience with it. Now, when you're dealing with feedback with traditional assessments, it's a rather straightforward process. And one of the easiest ways that you can do this, especially to provide students with immediate feedback, is to use what's called a double answer sheet. You can see that with this answer sheet, I would have students fill out both halves of the answer sheet as they're completing the assessment. And I could use this for true, false questions, A or B, for matching up the 5, even 10 options, multiple choice, completion, write the word or the number, the letter over there in the blank. Now, the way it works is this. Students complete the formative assessment, fill out both halves identically. As soon as they're finished, they tear the answer sheet in half they do meet, half they keep. We go over the assessment immediately in class, and they correct their own. Now, they know it does them no good to change any answers because I have the record already. It's not that I don't trust them, of course, but in this way, I offer my students immediate feedback on what they've done. They know what they got right, what they got wrong. They know who could be involved in corrective work, who's going to be involved in enrichment or extension work. I haven't even checked it yet. Now that night, I take it home and I make a little tally sheet like this. This is what I explained to you earlier. These are the results from a formative assessment in one of my classes. Now you can see my student did pretty well up to questions 7 and 8. Questions 7 and 8, something's wrong there. Now it could be those are bad questions. And that's the first thing I look for, because again, that's a teacher problem. I need to change that. But if I look at those and say, no, those are actually pretty good questions, it's clear that no matter how I taught it, just didn't come across. I'm going to have to change that. Similarly, look over question number 12. 17 students in my class missed that. That's almost a guessing level, right? Now, this leads me to another issue, and that is the use of common formative assessments. And common formative assessments are when teachers who teach the same class or the same grade use the same assessment and then compare the results. Here are the results of 3 teachers who used a common formative assessment. Now, these are rather typical of the results that we find. Let me give you just 30 seconds to look over this. And if you were an instructional coach for these 3 teachers, how could you use these results to help all 3 improve? Okay, let's take a look at this. You can see if all 3 teachers use the same assessment, it's pretty clear that item number 3 gets at a concept that Jen's students really found difficult. But Michael and Chris, their students did quite well. They can be an excellent resource for Jen on ways that she could improve her teaching in that area. But when you come down to item number 7, the concept with item number 7, now Jen is the expert. Her students did really well here, and she can really help Michael and Chris become a lot better. These are the kind of results we find typical when teachers get together, develop a common assessment, and then look at the results together. Now, look at question number 12. Everybody had trouble with that one. Now, it could be that that's a bad question, and maybe it's miskeyed or something, but again, that's good information for us to have. But if we look at that question and say, no, it actually is pretty good. This is an item, a concept that all 3 teachers are having some difficulties communicating well. And so it likely that these teachers will have to go beyond their expertise and look for other people in the building or other people in the area, go to local experts, turn to outside resources that can give them some guidance and direction. But still, it's a platform for doing that. It gives us this basis for making those kind of improvements. Now, sometimes students give us answers to questions we find very difficult to score. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. This is an example of an assessment that's used in many common, like large-scale assessments here in the States. It's assessment getting at the idea of adding fractions with unlike denominators. The Directions to this problem read as follows. A friend comes to you and shows you this work. You must explain to your friend if it is right or wrong, and then show your friend how you would think about the problem using some form of illustration. Now, once again, a friend comes to you and shows you this work. This is how they work the problem. You must explain to your friend if it's right or wrong, and then show them how you would think about the problem using some form of illustration. Now, the typical answer we get from students to this question is the following. Most students say, quote, I would tell my friend it is wrong. And then I would ask my friend, have you ever heard of least common denominator? Now, you see, if that's what a student puts down, it will not be scored very high. This can be scored on a scale 1, 2, 3, or 4. That would move you from 1 to a 2. But to get to a 3, the student would have to show using pie charts with different sections colored, rectangles with different portions shaded, glasses for the different levels. You take 2/3, you add 3/4 to it, you've got to get something more than 1. And if they're able to work it out to 12 and get the right answer, then they get 4 or full credit for their response. Now, I know that makes sense to you, but let me share the response of one student here in my state that we found very difficult to score. One student said, quote, I would tell my friend it is right. You see, I play basketball, and in basketball, we shoot 3 throws. In the first game, shooting free throws, I got 2 for 3. In the second game, I got 3 for 4. I am 5 for 7. Now, here's a kid who understands ratio, understands proportion, knows how to calculate his percentage when it comes to shooting free throws. How would you score that response? Now, again, that's a delight for us as teachers. It can really perplex the test development people. Here's another example you probably have seen. And this comes from a state assessment that was used for the high school level, getting at the Pythagorean theorem. That's the hypotenuse of right triangles. It's the a squared plus b squared equals c squared idea. Asked to find x, one student's response. Here's another item that I think you'll enjoy. This was developed by a law enforcement agency here in the States. Now, sometimes our learning goals are not able to be captured by those traditional assessments. And we're going to have to use an alternative assessment, right? If you're trying to get at whether kids can remember basic knowledge, recall some basic principles, traditional items work really well. But if you want to understand how well they can organize their thoughts and express their thoughts in written form, you can't get at that with traditional items. They have to do some writing. Now, we don't call them non-traditional because we've all had experience with skill demonstrations. Elementary teachers have been using, art teachers, music teachers, physical education teachers have always used. Oral presentations can be as simple as the elementary teacher asking students to respond orally to her questions to a formal presentation in front of the class. Task performances and complex problems like the math problem I just shared with you. Compositions, writing samples, laboratory experiments, project reports, group task portfolios. For them to become useful assessment tools, the key is going to be they must be accompanied by clearly specified performance criteria scoring rubrics. Now, there's been a lot written about rubrics, but I'm particularly fond of the work of my friend Susan Brookhart in this area. And Sue defines a rubric as a coherent set of criteria for students' work that includes descriptions of levels of performance quality on the criteria. Now, if you break down this definition, it's clear that a rubric has 2 parts: a set of criteria for what counts, and then descriptions of quality for each of those criteria, from poor to what would be excellent. Now, the other point that Sue makes with regard to rubrics is that rubrics don't judge performance. They actually should be built on describing performance. Now, as you describe performance, she also talks about 2 different types of rubrics. And she divides them into compliance rubrics, which just look at quantity, where you have required elements, checklists, accounts, and then quality rubrics would actually describe levels of different quality performance. Let me share with you some quick examples to illustrate this difference. Here's an example of a compliance quantity rubric for a poster project. And in this poster project, the students were expected to develop a poster, and there were 4 sort of critical elements or criteria: facts, graphics, grammar, and neatness. And you can see 1 through 4 is just, did they do it or did they not do it, right? This differs from differences in quality. And so with a learning rubric, and this is for a writing project, there were 3 different criteria employed here. And we're going to make copies of all of these slides available to you, so you don't have to worry about writing all these things down. But there were 3 criteria, content being 1, reasoning and evidence a 3rd, clarity being a 4th. And you can see how these 4 different levels show distinct differences in quality of the performance. And it's crucial that we keep this in mind. Now, when the standards movement was first initiated in the early 2000s, and we started doing this work on rubrics, we went about it in certain ways, but since then we've learned some lessons about what works and what doesn't work. Now, coming up with these graduated levels of quality can be tough, but I'm particularly fond here of the work of Judy Arter and Jay McTighe, who talk about coming up with those levels in terms of this 4 distinct qualities: no, no, but, yes, but, and then yes. Think back to the math problem, right? No, couldn't even get started. The no, but category is I'd ask them if they ever heard of least common denominator. No, it's not what we wanted, but there are some redeeming aspects to it. The yes, but, they did the illustration. They were able to show that, but they couldn't quite get at the 12s. And then the yes, then you're there. As you work and help teachers develop these rubrics, I know this seems overly simplistic, but it really works. I use this in my classes, and I find that it's really a helpful way of developing these kind of rubrics. Now, there are some important reasons why we need to use these. They do become powerful tools for teaching and assessment. By that, I mean the teachers should teach the rubric as part of the class. Students should understand how their performance, their demonstration, their project is going to be judged, what you're looking for there. When you do that, then the students become more thoughtful judges of their own work. You reduce the amount of time you have to spend going through it because you know specifically what you're looking for. It allows teachers to accommodate individual differences in heterogeneous classes. In my classes, for example, here at the university, I always have to distinguish between the student who understands a concept really well but has difficulty in expressing it in written form, versus the student who does not understand the concept at all but writes so beautifully. I mean, I teach research design classes here at my university, and I had a student who, on an essay question, an extended response for a research design question, began her response, quote, "It was a dark and stormy night." Now, this gives me a pretty clear indication we are going off in the wrong direction here. Easy to explain, I don't get into arguments with my students, and improves the objectivity in the scoring. Now, it is essential when you first begin that the teacher develop rubrics for the students, but once students become accustomed to it, it's a very valuable way of turning the responsibility over to students to come up with the rubrics themselves. Now, in doing that, though, we have to change the way we develop rubrics. This is something we've learned about this process, looking at how rubrics have been used just in recent years. The traditional approach to developing rubrics, we started with a level of proficiency. We had a couple of levels up to it, and we always had a level above. And that was the sort of the exemplary level or the distinguished level. And that generally worked okay in the elementary grades because the level above was always easy to establish. It was something you would do with the next higher level. The problem was that in middle schools and high schools, at the secondary level, the question of students and their parents wasn't what must they do to be proficient. The question was, how do we get the highest mark? And that whole approach just led to all kinds of controversy and all kinds of trouble. So the new approach we're taking is to actually start at the top level. Start at that top level, whatever it is to be. If it means being on more advanced material, that's fine, just be clear about it. If it means working on more cognitively complex material, that's fine, just be clear about it. We're going back to what Benjamin Bloom told us in the 1970s. He said, always begin with your model of excellence. Now, I know this runs counter to what other work that's been done, even some of my good friends who advocate a different process. But I always use the example of like Olympic archery. If you ever watch archery on television when the Olympics are being held, in Olympic archery, archers stand 70 meters from the target, and they have to hit a target that is just 12 centimeters in diameter. Now, that's really hard. I mean, if you stand 70 meters from something, 12 centimeters is really, really difficult. Now, if you did that, how could you ever exceed that? How could you go beyond that? And some people might say, well, maybe we should move the archer back to 80 meters. Or maybe we should make the target 6 centimeters instead of 12 centimeters. I said, that's great. But you've changed the standard. You've changed the goal. And I'm fine with that, but I want you to be clear about it. All we have to do is be clear about it. There are some people saying we should have a top level that's the wow experience, the blow my socks off experience. That doesn't work. We need to be clear about what we want that top level to be. So as you design rubrics, even if you have a not pass, pass, exemplary, begin by describing the exemplary. Begin by making that clear. So if a parent comes to you, if a student comes to you and says, I want to strive for the highest mark possible, you can say, this is what that looks like. Here's an example of that. So some tips, new insights for developing rubrics. Start with your model of excellence. Second, we found that you have to limit the number of criteria you include in any rubric. No more than 4 or 5. In fact, recently people have reduced that to about 3 to 4. Students cannot keep track of 10 criteria. It loses its value as a learning tool if we're looking at 10 things. And finally, remember that it's going to be describing performance, not evaluating it. Now, this doesn't mean you always have to use the same criteria. If I'm teaching composition, my students write a composition for me, I might evaluate it in terms of criteria 1, 2, 3, 4. And the second composition is 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the third composition, by the third composition, everybody has criteria 1 down. So in the third composition, I may do criteria 2, 3, 4, and 5. Fourth composition, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Well, now everybody has 2 down. So I could say fifth composition, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Over an instructional sequence, I might cover 10 different criteria. It's just in any single demonstration or performance, for it to be a valuable learning tool, got to get it down no more than 3 or 4, 5 at the absolute most. So again, some rules, beginning with the models of excellence. Avoid unclear language. Remember, this is going to be a teaching tool. And that means we have to be able to instruct students, describe in their performance what it looks like. Avoid unnecessary negative language. A problem that some teachers encounter when they start with a model of excellence is not this, not this, not this, not this. Improvement means diminishing number of no's, and you don't want to fall into that trap. And finally, once students understand the process, actually engage them in the process. Show them an example of really excellent work and a poor example and say, how are they different? How could you distinguish between these? What is it that made this one good and this one not so good? And they become owners of the whole process. And that means that they then begin modeling that work and incorporating that in their own performance as they go along. Now, in terms of the feedback we offer students and those comments, we do have some really important research evidence to indicate how this should be done. The best comments that are provided as a form of feedback, especially when you're dealing with these alternative forms of assessment, follow these 4 steps. Number 1, always begin with something positive. Now, it doesn't mean you have to praise. I'm not talking about praise here. I'm talking about this is what you did well. Here's what really, really was done very well in this. Second, you can describe what needs to be improved. After you do that, then you want to offer guidance and direction on how to make those improvements. And finally, express confidence in success. We find that if teachers can follow this in all their discussions with students and in all their discussions with parents and families, the impact is profound. When I talk with any family member, I always start and follow this 4-step process. Here are the things that your child is doing really well. Here are some things that we want to work on to improve. Here's some ideas on how we could do that. And I know they're going to be better. I know they can do this. I know they can be successful. That four-step process has been profound in terms of the influence we can have and how that feedback is received. That brings me to the very last point. The last point is we want to, as best as possible with all of our assessments, to ensure early success. This was an idea that was actually initiated by research that was conducted back in the 1950s. 1950s, there was a researcher, his name was Ellis Page. And Ellis Page found that when kids come into a new grade level, a new class, any new learning experience, that a lot of their attitudes and perceptions are pretty much up in the air. It's like it's a new class and new teachers and new subject, and maybe this will be different from every other learning experience I've had in the past. That flexibility in the perceptions continues until the first assessments are administered. And those first assessments then are graded or marked. Those marks put kids into a category. Getting out of that category is real tough, right? If there's one time in any instructional sequence that a teacher goes out of their way to guarantee that all kids have success, do it in the very first one. The very first one. That will set their disposition for everything that comes. You can convince them that that will be what they are able to achieve in the class. And I share this with you because it is very different from what I used to do. When I began teaching, I started middle school and I went to the high school level from there, secondary, and I taught honors classes. I taught the best achieving kids we had in the school. But I would purposely design my first assessment to be so difficult that it guaranteed most of them would fail. And that was then my chance to give them a little motivational speech, which I so enjoyed doing. And I would say to them, I told you this was hard. I told you this was difficult. There's a reason we refer to this subject as a discipline. You just found out what's going to happen to you if you don't work hard. I carried that over when I came here to the university. I mean, I teach classes that are really difficult. I teach statistics, right? And students in education hate statistics, but it's a required class. But I wanted to let them know in the first class how difficult the class was going to be. And I would let it be clear. I would say, look, this is not a class like any other you've taken. I mean, I want you to go home and I want you to have a conversation with your spouse tonight. Let them know that for the next 3 months, you are going to have to donate this many hours to this class every night. That you may not talk to them for a while because this has to be your priority. You have to devote it to this class. If you do not, you're not going to succeed. I would lose 20% of my students first class, second class. And I felt good about that. We need to weed them out anyway, right? Then I read Ellis Page. And Ellis Page says, give them success right from the start. It changed me completely. Changed me completely. Now, my first class is what I call my Tina Turner lecture. Now, let me explain to you the Tina Turner lecture. Here's the way it works. Students come in the first class, and we go over the syllabus. I talk about expectations, but I want to give them success. I want to show them they can do it. And so one of the things we do a lot in statistics is we use what's called regression analysis. And with regression analysis, what we do is we take a collection of measures on one set of things, and we use to predict another with some accuracy. So if I wanted to predict how well kids did in school, I could take a measure of their previous achievement. I could take a measure of the home support. I could take a measure of how much homework they do. I could take a measure of their level of aspiration. I could combine all those, and I could predict with pretty good accuracy how well they're going to do in school. So I explained this when there were some examples, but then I need to give them personal success. So I have a little questionnaire, and my questionnaire is 15 questions. They're very personal questions. I ask them only about themselves. Ask them a little bit about their background, their age, likes and dislikes, and asking about nobody else in their life. I show them that I can take their answers to these 15 personal questions. I can put them in my computer, and through regression analysis, I can predict with amazing accuracy what their spouse is like, what their husband, their wife, their boyfriend, their girlfriend, their partner. They're always shocked. They're always surprised about how accurate my predictions are. Now, the question is, why do I call my Tina Turner lecture? What's love got to do with it? Come on, folks, you're going to stay with me here, right? Now, see, the point is they leave that first class now with success. I mean, sure, it's a little bit funny, but they see how this works. They feel success in it. Do you know, I get everybody back for the second class now. I don't lose anybody. In fact, my enrollment goes up from first class to second class because they feel they can do it. You see, there's no area in all of education that we have investigated more than student motivation. And the key, all these studies show what the key to student motivation is: success. Kids persist in activities in which they can experience some degree of success, and they avoid with passion those things in which they're not successful or believe they cannot be. Classic example, how many of you have taken up Wordle, right? Wordle is addictive because it gives you success, right? All computer apps, all computer games do exactly the same. The best-selling computer game of all time, Pac-Man, right? Pac-Man. Now think about this. What's the purpose of Pac-Man? Basically, you gobble up dots. Now think about this. What is interesting about gobbling dots? What's relevant to anybody's life about doing it? We want teachers to engage students in things we think are interesting, relevant to their lives. What is interesting or relevant about gobbling up dots? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. All right? And people say, well, it's not really that, it's the reward you get. But that's not true either. What did you get in Pac-Man if you gobble up all the dots? You got more dots. That's a great reward. That's like saying, look, kid, do these 10 problems, right? I'll give you 10 more to do, right? It has nothing to do with the reward. It was success. Every time you played, you got a chance to improve your score. Every kid who's ever played Pac-Man can describe the first time they got all the dots. The machine played a little song for them, the first new screen of dots, right? It's that success. The challenge for us as teachers is how can we build that into our teaching through assessments? How can we provide students with that kind of success by assessing valuable, important learning goals, but showing them there's a way that they can succeed? By using assessments as a source of information, by following assessments with high quality corrective instruction, by providing students with the second chance to experience that success, and building in these ideas, adapting assessments to those learning goals. Now, I can share with you some examples of how to use this in the class. It generally generates some questions or concerns. When a question is always comes up is, how am I going to provide enough time? I barely get through the curriculum now, and you're telling me I need to extend units by providing time for this feedback, this corrective process, second assessment. I'll never be able to cover the material. And it's true. When you first start, it does take more time because the correctives have to be done in class under your direction. That takes a little bit of time. Prior to this, all of my units were like 5-day units. It was like 5, 5, 5, 5 throughout. I'm not sure why. I mean, harsh toilet training, part of my mom, maybe, I don't know. It just worked out that way. Now my first unit is 7 days. I've lost 2 days, but here's the point. Don't despair. Keep in mind where you want to be at the end. See your pathway to the end more flexibly, right? As I move along, I start reducing the class time I've allocated to correctives. It's fairly easy to do because my students catch on. They're prepared for each new unit. So my enrichment group is growing, my corrective group is shrinking. The amount of corrective work they have to do becomes less. They're better prepared for later units so I can go through those later units more rapidly. And plus, I've changed my instructional format. Prior to this, I would always have lesson, 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 review, assessment. Now I don't. Now I have lesson, 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 formative. I do not review prior to the formative. I take the time I normally spend for the review, I shift it over to the corrective phase. I find I'm a lot more efficient in my review. I have the results from the formative so I can concentrate on the things that are major problems for my students. Plus, I feed those students that don't need the review. They're engaged in enrichment. I'm working with a smaller group. I'm a lot more efficient. In the classes that I teach right now, right, when we get to the midterm, I am 1 full unit behind everybody else that teaches the same class. At the final exam, I'm 1 unit ahead. I cover more material than they using this process. You have to have flexibility in your pacing. Keep in mind where you want to be at the end. Just see your pathway to that in more flexible terms for you and for your students. Some people get concerned about motivation. And the key is there has to be some incentive. You need to think about exciting, challenging things that students can engage in when they do show success on those first formatives. That's the key to success. Some people get concerned about what to do after a second assessment. Am I going to go back a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time? The answer is no. If you do that, you're insisting on one learning sequence for everybody. And we now understand that not only do students learn in different ways, they learn things in different order. If there is one learning sequence by which all children learn to read, don't you think every reading series in the world will look the same? They don't. They'll have a different sequence of skills. Some kids who really struggle with basic skills are very sophisticated in problem solving. When they engage in problem solving, the basic skills begin to make sense. Other kids need mastery of the basic skills before they can extend that to problem solving situations. That means that when you move on with more advanced units, you must incorporate what we call spiraling items on formative assessments. Spiraling items are items refer back to previous material, previous units. Doesn't have to be a lot. Our evidence indicates that about 5 to 10% of the items on any assessment should be spiraling. Oh, maybe up to 20%, right? And so if I have a 20-item classroom assessment, I'm talking 3 or 4 questions, right? We do it for 2 reasons. Number one, it's the best device we know to enhance retention. It helps students understand they need to carry these things over from one unit to the next. But second, it's a wonderful way of capturing those things that are difficult even though we did move on. So if you are a student in my class and there was a concept in the first unit with which you struggled, you did poorly on the first assessment, did some corrective work on it, but still missed it on the second assessment. Well, lo and behold, a question about that same concept shows up at the end of unit 2. And if you struggle with it there, you'll do corrective work on it again, and we'll see it on the second assessment of unit 2. If it's still problematic, you could see it at the end of unit 3. Right? And plus, I have my summative assessments. Summative assessments tend to be cumulative, especially at the secondary level over multiple units. Multiple opportunities to learn does not mean sit there and try to pound it into their head before you consider anything else. It means go on, come back to it at a later time. When you come back to it, it's likely to be easy for those kids. It's keeping in mind where you're going to be at the end, seeing your pathway to the end in more flexible terms. I saw a classic example of this recently. A very elementary teacher takes her kindergarten children to the gymnasium on the first day of school. She has them line up on the line, on one of the lines painted on the floor. And she says, now, boys and girls, when I say go, I want everybody to run from behind this line over and touch the wall on the other side of the gym. Ready? Go. That'll take off. She calls them back. She has them line up again. This is now, boys and girls, I have some very important questions, thinking questions. So think carefully about this. Here's the first question. Did every one of you run to the other side of the gym in exactly the same way? As you know, we all ran there in different ways. Isn't that wonderful? Now, here's the second question, a little harder. Think carefully. Did everyone get to the other side of the gym at exactly the same time? Say, no, we all got there at different times. Isn't that amazing? Now, here's the last question, and the most important. Did everybody get there? They say, yes. She says, that is exactly what kindergarten is like. Here's where you are today. That's where you're going to be at the end of the year. Everybody gets there. And it's carrying over that same technique to what it is we're trying to accomplish here, right? Now, I've covered a lot of material in a very short period of time. Wanted to review these very quick, sort of crucial steps for assessment practice. Number one, establish your priority, communicate it to everybody. 2, make sure assessments become an integral part of the instructional process, keeping in mind those 3 implications: source of information, followed by high quality corrective instruction, another second opportunity for students to demonstrate success. Recognize that different assessment formats require different types of feedback, all right? And then finally, ensure that early success. We did want to take some time to address any questions or concerns you have. I can't promise that I have answers to these things, but are there things that came up in the discussion that I can try to clarify? things that might make sense. Jenna's going to moderate this for me and let me know what those questions are. We'll try to see if we can take some of those on, and then I'll share with you some sort of guidelines for better practice to conclude our session.
Thanks, Tom. I've got a couple of questions here that have come through via email and things that I'm going to share, but I'd also like to invite those on the call, if you've got questions, just to pop them in the chat at this point. And our Auckland and Wellington regional teams who are together, if you want to curate some questions as well. The first question that I'm going to pose to you, Tom, is around, again, we know how much time, the argument of how much time, effective assessment practices take. And there's a question here around, should classroom teachers begin a class, begin a unit with their own assessments? Or is there a way that we can foster a culture of trusting the previous teacher's end of year assessment information and use that to inform the beginning of our programs?
Yeah, well, that sort of deals with the notion of pre-assessments and we use there, and we probably should do a whole nother session of pre-assessments. But the thing to keep in mind there is that pre-assessments take on 3 different forms. There are 3 different types of pre-assessments, and we call them present, prerequisite, and then preview. Present pre-assessments really try to capture kids' attitudes and dispositions and likes and dislikes at the present time. Preview pre-assessments talk about what's coming up. This is the typical design in like pre-post research designs, where I could have, when we started this section tonight, I could have given you a pre-test on the things that I wanted to cover. When the session's over, I give you a post-test, I see how much you gained during that time. But the third type is what we call prerequisite pre-assessments. And prerequisite pre-assessments capture what are the essential elements that students need to get started in this one. Now, when we look at research studies in those 3 different types of pre-assessments, the only one for which there is consistently positive results is the prerequisite pre-assessments. Present pre-assessments and preview pre-assessments tend to have as many negative consequences as they do positive. It's like if I gave you a pre-assessment before teaching you anything tonight, most people would have done rather poorly. It's like before I teach you anything, I show you how little you know. Why would you want to do that, right? But if I said, here are 2 things that we need to know to get started, and if I took a couple of minutes at the start to introduce those 2 things and make sure everybody had sort of a mastery level on those 2 things, it gives you the foundation you need to have to get started. And so in terms of starting the year, I would really recommend that instead of teachers looking back at the 10 to 20 things kids might have missed last year, look ahead. In this coming unit, what are the 2 things they really need to have to get started? What are the 2 things that I really want to make sure they know well in order to be in a position to gain the greatest benefit from this particular unit? And I'm going to take a little bit of time to work on those prerequisites. So when you think about pre-assessments, instead of thinking about the preview or the present, think about prerequisites. Think about what do you want the students to have in order to start with a solid base, to start on a level playing field, and provide that for them, and then be able to go on. When you do that, you're likely to meet far greater success.
Yeah, that's you've referred there to flipped learning, or that preloading and front loading of the required knowledge in order to then access the current learning, which I think is a really good way of addressing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've got a question in the chat around particular resources on formulating different types of assessment questions, and I'm wondering whether, out of all of the content that you've written, is there one book or paper or piece of work that you would say is a must read for every teacher?
Well, it's is what you've identified as a real problem we have, because very few teachers have had extensive training in assessment development. Um, Even the little brief introduction that we use tonight, talking about the traditional assessments and alternative assessments, most of us don't have a lot of background or training in that, and especially when it comes to the development of rubrics. I think that I would recommend to you the book by Susan Brookhart on development of rubrics. This is a book published by ASCD, and it is the best that I know out there. Um, and Sue does a really good job of making it practical. And so when we move to these alternative assessments, and so many of the things we're trying to help students achieve deal with those higher level, more complex skills. And that means that the alternative assessments are going to be the best way of capturing those skills. And that means we have to have rubrics to provide students with adequate feedback on those. And so I'd recommend the book by Susan Brookhart on developing rubrics as a really good foundation to give you the basis you'll need for developing those rubrics that can be really important for those alternative forms of assessment.
That's great. Thank you. Coming back to the time factor, what are your suggestions around building in or making time for those structured opportunities for teachers to plan collaboratively, discuss the results of assessments together, and things like that in terms of wider school systems?
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any good way to do that. What we do know, though, is that we must get away from rigid adherence to these sort of planning guides or pacing guides. Because typically what they do is they look at the scope of the whole year, they divide it into segments, and each segment is allotted the same amount of time. And that's not the way it works. The way it works is that teachers need time at the beginning of the year to really get students into the process. So that's why I said prior to this, all of my units were the same length, and they were all 5 days, and that just seemed to work pretty well. But now, incorporating this, my first unit is 7 days. Now, again, I could look at that and say, well, I've lost 2 days. But I encourage teachers, don't get upset about this. Do keep in mind where you want to be at the end. Just see a more flexible pathway to getting there. It takes some time early on to get students into this process. And that's why the corrective work needs to be done in class under the teacher's direction. But once students see how it benefits them and how they personally can be successful, that provides the motivation for them to do well. And sometimes just offering a bit of sort of external assessment can be helpful, or a general kind of reward. Let me give you a quick example. A few years ago, I felt a bit remiss because I'd never taught in the lower elementary grades. As I shared with you, I began in middle grades and went to the secondary high school level from there. So I took a leave of absence from the university. There was a teacher in a school near here to where I live who was going maternity leave. She taught second grade, grade 2, and I took over her classroom. Now, prior to that time, I also thought that 7-year-olds were charming and endearing people. They're not. Some are evil, but it did convince me that I had to really adapt these ideas differently. But when I returned to the university after being in the second grade classroom, I had all my stickers left over. Every second grade teacher uses stickers, right? The little things you put on the kids' papers, and the stinky stickers, the scratch and snippets, the kids love them. So I started putting stickers on my graduate students' papers when they reached the mastery level. Now, no idea if this was making any difference, but in my class that very first semester back, there was a woman who struggled terribly. Her name was Elizabeth. Elizabeth was very bright, but she struggled with the statistics. The fourth unit, she came up to me after class and said, Dr. Gusky, I reached the mastery level in my assessment. I said, Elizabeth, that's terrific. I know this has been a hard view. I know it's been a struggle, but look at that. All your hard work, your diligent effort have paid off. I'm proud of you, Elizabeth. You should be proud too. She said yes and looked down and said, but I didn't get a sticker. I neglected to put a sticker on her paper. Now, don't get the idea that I am taking away the valuable benefit of intrinsic motivation by offering these silly stickers. That is not the point. My graduate students do not work hard for stickers. It's tangible recognition of success. And that's all that it is. Tangible recognition of success. In fact, what they've started to do now, my graduate students, they peel the stickers off of their papers and they stick them on their notebooks. They kind of line them up along there. Some of them put them on their laptops. All right. And I was watching, we are on a semester system here at my university. At the end of every semester, we have final examination week. And I had 57 students in my class a couple of years ago, and I was counting as they were coming to take their final exam. 49 out of 57 walked in carrying a notebook or a computer with stickers lined up on the outside. Average age, 41. All right. Not kids here. Now, you might think that's silly, but that little bit of recognition is very powerful. And you know where the idea came from? The idea actually came from the military. Think of the photograph of any high-ranking military officer you see in any armed service around the world. And what you always see on their chest right here, all those multicolored ribbons, right? We call them battle ribbons. And where did the idea of battle ribbons come from? Well, think of it. If every armed service in the world used them, it came from Napoleon. Napoleon developed this idea of that little bit of recognition for every campaign, every success you made it through. And Napoleon's famous quote was, "Give me enough ribbon and I will conquer the world." That little bit of recognition for success. And so that's why, knowing that success is the most powerful motivation device, I'm going to capitalize it on every way I can. I'm going to let my students know that they can be successful. I'm going to express my confidence in their success. I'm going to show them that they can. I'm going to recognize them for doing it. And that alone, students will love statistics if you show them they can succeed at statistics. I see evidence of that all the time. And so it's building that in that we want to make sure that we do provide students with those kind of opportunities. Now, before we close today, and I did want to share with you some real quick guidelines for better practice. I don't know we have best practice really in line yet. And if this hasn't come through in what I've shared with you already, then I've been truly remiss. Number one, always adapt your assessments as learning goals. Don't take on the idea that some perfect assessment format, but there's not. This is the tragic results we're seeing with people being enamored with project-based learning. Projects are great and they capture certain things really well, but they don't capture everything well. And you always have to make sure that your assessments capture the learning goals that you count as most important. What do we want students to learn and be able to do is your start. And then what evidence do we think best reflects that learning? Number two, feedback first, evaluation second. Remember, your primary goal is student learning. See, what we've said is that any academic discipline, any subject area is infinite. There's no limit to what you can learn in any subject area or any academic discipline, but a curriculum is finite. And as soon as we define a curriculum, we specify within that entire domain the things we believe are most important for students to learn. Once we identify that curriculum, it becomes our job as educators to have all of our students learn that excellently. Not just some, not just half, all. And what can we do to move in that direction? The best thing we can do, focus on the feedback to guide them in that. Our primary goal is always going to be student learning. And finally, remember the feedback has to include guidance and direction on how to improve. It needs to be different from visual instruction. Don't get caught up in reteaching. Guidance and direction on how they can improve must be different from the original instruction. That's why there's no best type of corrective or guidance. It depends on the original instruction. And so maybe your initial instruction would be excellent as a corrective for mine and vice versa. So remember, it's going to be different from the original instruction, and then to be possible, adapt to the student's needs. Here again is my contact information. We'll make sure that we provide copies of these slides to everybody, so you'll have those as a resource. But if other questions or concerns come up, I hope you won't hesitate to get in touch with me. I can't promise that I have answers, but maybe I can send you some resources or references to other work or some people you might want to contact as well. So for my part, thank you for giving up this part of your morning to be with us today. I hope it has been helpful. I hope that it's guided you in the important work you're doing. I look forward to hearing from you. And if any questions or concerns come up, I hope you will get in touch with me. Jenna?
Thank you so much, Tom. Your kōrero today has been both engaging and informative. one of the things that you said that particularly resonated with me, because it aligns with our understandings and beliefs around assessment here in New Zealand, is around the primary purpose of assessment being to inform the teaching and learning and to provide feedback to the teacher about whether our teaching practice has been successful in actually causing learning to occur. And I saw from the response in the chat that many of our audience were particularly interested in your points about providing opportunities for students to have second and third chances to experience success. Once again, we appreciate you spending your time with us online and the thought and preparation that you've put in leading up to this webinar. I'd also like to extend our warmest thanks to the audience with us here on the call today. We value your engagement in this topic and your input in the chat and your questions and comments. Tom, the whakatauki, or the proverb that I shared at the beginning of your talk in the introduction, means with your basket and my basket, the kete will be full. And it's a Māori proverb that talks about the sharing of knowledge and collaborating and working together. And you've reiterated that message throughout your talk as well today. Hopefully every person on the call has each found something new to add to their kete of knowledge and to take away from today and reflect on, as we'll get ready for another term of leading learning within our own contexts back out in our schools. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with us via our website at Cognition if you'd like to continue a conversation about assessment or support within the PLD space. As Tom said, he's happy to be contacted as well if you want to continue the conversation with him. And keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars and workshop offerings, both online and around the motu in New Zealand. Finally, Tom, we wish you all the best on your upcoming trip. Enjoy your time with your daughter in Greece. Thanks again for joining us, everybody. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.